Cora Whitaker had stitched up gunshot wounds before, but never on a man who'd just put a bullet in someone else. At 27, she'd learned the world didn't hand out mercy for free. She'd buried her mother young, watched her father gamble away every dollar she earned on the night shift, and signed away her last paycheck to keep a roof she'd already lost. So when a smooth-talking loan shark named Felix promised her debt would vanish if she just served drinks at one private party, she swallowed her pride and said yes, because desperate people don't get to ask what kind of party it is. She didn't know the guests there traded in stolen art and darker things in the same breath. She didn't know the man at the center of that candlelit room, the one everyone called the Undertaker, was Julian Voss, 37 years old, the most feared crime boss in New York. A man who'd clawed his way out of nothing and trusted no one because the one person he'd ever loved, his little sister, had slipped away on a hospital gurney while strangers decided she wasn't worth saving. And she certainly didn't know that when the gunfire started, when a bullet meant for Julian tore through the chaos, he'd pull her into the shadows and press his mouth to hers, hard and deliberate, using a terrified stranger as a mask so his enemies would think she was his. It lasted seconds. It changed everything. Because in Julian's world, a kiss isn't tenderness, it's a brand. And by morning, every rival family in the city believed the woman with the tired eyes and the nurse's hands belonged to the Undertaker himself. Cora thought she'd been let go. She thought she could slip back into her quiet, exhausted little life. She had no idea a man who'd forgotten how to feel anything was already losing sleep over her, that the cruelest woman in the underworld had just circled her name in red. Or that the one friend she trusted most wasn't who she seemed to be. If you're enjoying this story so far, please tap that like button, share it with someone who loves a dangerous romance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. Now let's go back to the night it all began. The black car sped through the night like a silent beast, and for the entire ride Tomas did not say another word beyond the clipped warning he threw back over his shoulder as he pushed her into the back seat. Don't tell anyone what you saw. Don't try to understand what just happened. And most importantly, don't ever mention that name. When the car stopped on an unfamiliar street corner where Cora had never set foot before, the door swung open, and he said only one more sentence before vanishing into the darkness. Go home and pray they forget you. Cora stood rooted to the cold sidewalk for a long while, her bare feet trembling inside her cheap shoes, not because of the early winter chill, but because of something deeper. A fear that had seeped all the way into the marrow of her bones. She lifted a hand to her lips, and no matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't erase the icy feeling left there, the coldness of a man she had never known, a man who had looked at her with eyes as black as two bottomless wells, eyes that held not the smallest trace of human warmth. She caught the last subway train of the night, sitting curled in the corner of the nearly empty car, her two hands clenched together in her lap to keep them from shaking. And she told herself over and over in her mind that it was over, that she was only a poor nurse with nothing worth taking, that those powerful and terrifying people would never bother to remember the face of a server carrying drinks. When she reached her shabby apartment on the 5th floor of an old building in Brooklyn, the eviction notice was still pasted to the door, the edges of the paper curling from the damp, the bold printed words reminding her that she had only 9 days left before she was thrown onto the street. And in that moment, Cora almost laughed at the cruel irony of fate, because only a few hours earlier, she had been worried about having a roof over her head, and now she was worried about whether she would still be alive to need one. She stepped inside, locked the door, then fastened the safety latch she had never once used in all 3 years of living there, and she leaned her back against the cold door, slowly sliding down to the floor, hugging her knees as she tried to breathe. The apartment was pitch dark and silent, with only the sickly yellow streetlight spilling through the window and painting long, uneven streaks across the peeling wall. In that stillness, Cora could hear every frantic beat of her own heart. She thought of her mother, the gentle woman who had left the world too soon, when Cora was still too young to understand what loss meant, and she wondered whether, if her mother were still alive, she would hold Cora in her arms and tell her that everything would be all right, even though both mother and daughter would know it was only a kind lie. She thought of her father, the man she still loved, even though he had turned her life into a chain of long nights spent paying debts, and a familiar anger rose in her chest. Because if only he hadn't borrowed money, if only she hadn't had to carry those debts in his place, she never would have had to set foot inside that candlelit room, glittering with danger and filled with dangerous men. But then she pushed the thought away, because blaming her father wouldn't change anything, and what she needed now was to forget, to bury herself in sleep, to wake up tomorrow morning and return to her small, exhausted life as though this night had never existed. She dragged herself into the bathroom, turned on a faucet, and when she saw her face in the cracked mirror, Cora almost didn't recognize herself. Her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, and now lit with a panic she had never seen there before. She splashed cold water over her face, trying to wash it all away. But no matter how cold the water was, the image of that man kept coming back, his black hair, his sharply cold face without the slightest expression, and the way he had looked at her in that final moment before Tomas dragged her away, a gaze she couldn't decipher, as if he were weighing how much she was worth, and at the same time bewildered by himself. She lay down on the sagging bed without even changing her clothes, pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes, telling herself that by morning everything would go back to the way it had been. But even when exhaustion finally dragged her down into a broken sleep, some deep part of Cora's heart whispered a truth she wasn't ready to face, that there are doors which, once opened, can never truly be closed again, and that her life, whether she wanted it or not, had just turned onto a road from which she could no longer turn back. 2 days passed, and Cora tried to force herself to believe that the nightmare had truly ended, that she could step back into the familiar rhythm of life, like someone who had just awakened from a terrible dream and decided not to think about it anymore. She put on her pale blue nurse's uniform, frayed at the cuffs, caught the familiar train to the public hospital in downtown Brooklyn, and tried to keep her hands busy with the tasks she had done thousands of times before, taking blood pressure, changing bandages, writing notes in medical charts, soothing an elderly man who refused to take his medicine. But something inside her had changed. An invisible wire of tension stretched across her chest that made her startle every time a door slammed shut, every time a stranger passed through the hallway, and let his eyes rest on her for 1 second longer than normal. She told herself she was only being paranoid, that sleepless nights and leftover fear were playing tricks on her mind, but that unease kept clinging to her like a thin mist that wouldn't dissolve, not clear enough for her to name, but not vague enough for her to ignore. Priya was the first to notice. Priya Sharma had worked the night shift with Cora for more than a year, a girl with a warm smile and sharp eyes that always noticed the things other people missed, and also the closest, almost the only, friend Cora had in this cold city. When the two of them were standing beside the nurse's station during their break, Priya tilted her head and looked at her for a long moment, then gently touched her arm and asked in a soft voice, "What's wrong, Cora? For the past 2 days, you've looked like your soul has gone missing, your eyes are dark, and you keep jumping at every little thing. Did something happen to you?" Cora forced a smile, shook her head, and offered the familiar excuse she always used to hide everything. "I'm just tired. Too many shifts in a row in the rent situation. You know how it is." But Priya didn't believe her as easily as usual. She pulled Cora down onto the plastic chair in the corner of the break room, poured her a cup of hot tea from the thermos she always carried, and looked straight into her eyes with a concern that made Cora feel both warmed and faintly confused, because Priya asked more questions than she normally did, asking where Cora had gone that night, asking whether she had gotten into trouble with her father, or with the debt collectors, asking whether she needed a temporary place to stay if the housing situation grew worse. Cora accepted the cup of tea with both hands, still trembling a little, letting the warmth seep into her skin, and in that moment she almost wanted to tell her everything, wanted to pour out the terrible weight pressing on her chest, wanted to tell Priya about the candlelit room, about the gunshot, about the man with those black eyes. But then the clipped warning of the man named Tomas rang again inside her head. "Don't tell anyone," and she swallowed all those words down, only saying softly that she was fine, that she just needed a good sleep to recover. Priya looked at her for another moment, something passing through her eyes that Cora couldn't read in time. Then she smiled and gave her friend's hand a gentle squeeze. "You know you can trust me, Cora. Anything, anytime. I'm always here for you." Those words should have comforted Cora, and they did, but somewhere in a hidden corner deep inside her, A strange feeling flickered through her so quickly that she couldn't catch hold of it, a vague suspicion with no explanation. Because there was something in the way Priya asked. In her eagerness that was just a little too much, that suddenly felt strange to Cora, though she pushed it away at once, and scolded herself for being so distrustful that she was even doubting her best friend. When the shift ended and the two women parted at the hospital gate, beneath the dim yellow light of early morning, Priya hugged her tightly and told her to remember to text when she got home safely. And Cora nodded, walking away into the freezing air, her heart a little lighter because of the warmth of that friendship, never knowing that the vague unease she felt wasn't the product of an exhausted imagination, that there really were eyes watching her, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes from the very place where a person feels safest. The next night, when her shift ended later than usual because of a long emergency case, Cora stepped out into the parking lot behind the hospital alone. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and the whole area was drowned in a cold light spilling from a few dim high-pressure lamps, many of the bulbs already burned out, leaving ragged patches of darkness stretching between the silent rows of parked cars. Priya had gone home before her because of a family matter, so Cora crossed the empty lot by herself, both hands pushed deep into the pockets of her thin coat, her breath turning into white smoke in the freezing air, and the vague unease that had followed her. For days, suddenly grew so thick she could barely breathe, as though something were closing in around her. She was just about to quicken her steps toward the train station when a figure separated from the darkness between two trucks parked close to the wall. A large man in a black leather jacket, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, and he walked straight toward her with an easy, threatening stride, the kind of ease that belonged to someone who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Cora froze, her heart pounding up into her throat, and when the man spoke, his hoarse voice made every hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "You're Cora Whitaker. Aren't you the nurse?" he said, his mouth lifting into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Someone very much wants to talk to you about that night in Manhattan, about where you were and who you were standing beside, and if you come with me quietly, this will be much easier for both of us." Cora backed away one step, then another, her mouth dry, and she stammered that he had the wrong person, that she didn't know anything, but the man only gave a harsh little laugh and moved closer, his broad hand reaching out to seize her arm. And in that terrifying moment, just as Cora opened her mouth to scream, a cold voice rang out from behind them and cut through everything. "Take your hand off her now, if you still want to keep your life." The man in the leather jacket stopped short, and Cora turned toward the voice, recognizing at once the slender but dangerous figure of Tomas, the man who had dropped her on that strange street corner on that fateful night, now standing there with both hands tucked into the pockets of his black coat, his face calm and unreadable, but his eyes sharp as knives. A tense standoff stretched between the two men, a few clipped words exchanged in a hidden language Cora didn't fully understand, but she understood the ending of it when the man in the leather jacket spat onto the concrete, threw her a look full of hatred, then backed into the darkness and disappeared, leaving Cora shaking in the middle of the parking lot, her knees nearly giving way beneath her. Tomas stepped toward her without a single word of comfort, only pulling her into the shadow of a wall away from the light before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "You're in much deeper trouble than you think, girl, and you need to understand that right now." Cora lifted her eyes to him, red with fear and anger, and demanded to know why they were looking for her, what she had done wrong. And Tomas stared at her for a long moment before letting out a breath and telling her the truth she didn't want to hear, that on the night of that auction, in front of dozens of eyes belonging to the most powerful and dangerous people in this city, the man named Julian Voss had marked her as his, and in the world Tomas lived in, a mark like that carried more weight than a contract signed in blood. It meant that every enemy Julian had now saw her as his weakness, as a bargaining chip, as a target. Cora listened and felt as though the ground beneath her feet were collapsing, and a surge of anger rose inside her, overpowering even her fear. She clenched both fists and forced out the words through the tightness in her throat. "But I didn't choose this. I didn't want anything to do with him. I didn't even know who he was until a few hours before that, and now I have to pay the price for something I never agreed to." Tomas looked at her with a gaze that held the faintest trace of pity, but also a brutal coldness, And then he said quietly that in their world, almost no one got to choose their own fate, and that from this moment on, whether she wanted it or not, the name Cora Whitaker no longer belonged only to her. Cora couldn't remember how she had gotten home after that horrifying night in the parking lot, only that she hadn't been able to close her eyes, sitting curled in the corner of the room, until gray dawn slipped through the window, and all through the next day she startled at every sound, her hands shaking so badly that she even dropped a glass of water. So when night fell and the whole old building sank into silence, just as she was about to spread the thin blanket over the couch, because she didn't dare sleep in the bedroom, the lights in the apartment suddenly flickered and went out, and in that pitch-black moment, Cora felt a presence, an invisible pressure pressing down on the air so heavily that a chill ran down her spine before she could even see anything. She had only just managed to reach for the fruit knife on the kitchen table when a deep, cold voice sounded from the darkness in the corner of the room. "You won't need that." Cora spun around, the knife trembling in her hand, only to find herself facing the very man who had haunted every broken sleep she had had for days. Julian Voss stood there, tall and motionless among the sickly yellow streaks of light spilling in from the street lamps. His black suit seemed to melt into the shadows until only his sharply cold face and dark eyes stood out. The eyes she still remembered with painful clarity. Eyes that held not the smallest trace of human warmth. She asked in a broken voice how he had gotten in here, how he knew where she lived, and Julian only tilted his head slightly, his mouth lifting into a smile that wasn't truly a smile. "There isn't a door in this city that can stay closed to me, Miss Whitaker, and finding you was even easier than I wanted it to be." He took one step forward, and Cora backed away until her spine touched the ice-cold wall, the knife still pointed in front of her, even though she knew it was laughably useless against a man like him. Julian glanced at the blade with indifference, then took a thick envelope from inside his coat pocket and tossed it onto the table with a careless motion, as though throwing away a piece of trash. "There's $50,000 in cash inside," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Enough for you to disappear from New York tonight, change your name, go somewhere far away, some small town in the Midwest where no one knows who you are, and never come back. You're a mistake, an unnecessary complication I need to clean up, and this is the cleanest way for both of us." A heavy silence followed, and then something inside Cora, something that had been trampled and drained dry through all 27 years of her poor life, suddenly broke open into fury. She set the knife down on the table, lifted her head, and looked straight into those black eyes as she spoke, her voice trembling but not retreating. "So that's all I am to you then. Something you can pay for and throw away, a problem you can tidy up and remove. You know, my whole life, too many people have looked at me as something that could be bought. My father pushed me into his debts. The loan sharks turned me into payment, and now there's you, standing here, throwing money in my face as though my life and my dignity can be converted into the bills inside that envelope. I may be poor, I may be nothing in your world, but I'm not for sale, Mr. Voss, and I won't take a single cent from you." A strange silence fell over the dark apartment, and for the first time since he had entered, something flickered through Julian's expressionless eyes, a very faint surprise, as though in all his years sitting at the summit of power, he had never met anyone who dared to throw his money back at him along with her pride. He stared at her for a long while, his face still cold as stone, but his gaze changed. Then he took the envelope back, his voice quieter but still sharp with ice. "You really are a fool, Miss Whitaker, and your pride won't help you when they come looking for you again." Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving Cora standing there, her heart pounding, both terrified and trembling from the very courage she hadn't known she possessed. After the night Julian Voss walked out of her apartment with the rejected envelope, Cora could no longer keep pretending she was only an accidental victim of a misunderstanding, because too many things didn't fit together, too many pieces kept scraping against her mind and leaving her unable to rest, and she decided that if this whole world was pushing her into a game whose rules she didn't understand, then at the very least she had to know how she had been dragged into it. She began with the source of every misfortune in her life, her father, and the next morning she went to the shabby rented room where Walter Whitaker was staying after having pawned nearly everything he had ever owned. The old man sat hunched by the window, his hands trembling with the fear and regret of someone who had lived too long inside both, and when he saw his daughter walk in, his face went strangely pale, a flicker of fear passing over it that Cora caught at once. She asked him directly about the debt, about the man named Felix who had pushed her toward that fateful party. And at first, Walter only stammered and tried to deny it in circles. But when Cora told him about the gunshot, about how she had nearly been kidnapped right in the hospital parking lot, the old man lowered his head into his hands and began to confess through tears the truth he had kept hidden. It turned out Walter's debt wasn't owed to some ordinary loan shark at all, but to the Dresco family, one of the most powerful and brutal families in the New York underworld, Julian Voss's sworn enemy. And that man Felix wasn't a loan money lender, as she had believed, but someone working directly for them, a small pawn inside that family's machine. Walter sobbed as he told her he had gambled until there was nothing left to pay, and when the Dresco men came for him, they didn't demand money. They demanded something else. They wanted him to hand over his daughter, not to hurt her, but to push her into the right place, at the right time, into the underground auction party where Julian Voss would be present. Cora stood frozen as the final pieces locked together into a picture that made her blood turn cold, because she realized that her presence in that candlelit room that night had never been a coincidence, that she had been chosen, arranged, pushed into Julian's orbit on purpose by his own enemies. Walter, through broken and choking words, revealed one more thing he had accidentally overheard from the Dresco men, that their plan was to create a link between her and Julian, even if it was only a fragile suspicion in the eyes of the underworld, so from there they could turn her into a weakness, an invisible string they could pull to manipulate from a distance the monster the entire city feared, because a man like Julian Voss had no family, no lover, nothing at all for anyone to use against him, and if they could attach a weakness to him, even a false one, then they would have in their hands a priceless weapon. What neither the Dresco family nor Walter could have expected was that Julian would accidentally turn that false connection into something real that very night, through his own actions, in front of dozens of watching eyes, making their plan both succeed and slip beyond anyone's control in a way no one had foreseen. Cora stepped back and leaned against the stained wall of the rented room, feeling both furious and horrified, and when she looked at the old father trembling and crying as he begged for forgiveness, a tearing pain rose inside her, because she understood that with his own hands, whether out of fear or because he had been forced, he had sold her into a world she had no way to escape. She couldn't speak. She only turned silently and walked out of the room, leaving behind her father's weeping and carrying with her a truth heavier than anything she had ever imagined, that she wasn't an accident, but a pawn placed on the board by merciless hands, and that the game had only just begun. Carrying the heavy truth she had just learned, Cora wandered aimlessly through the cold streets, her heart so empty and bewildered that she felt as though she might shatter into pieces. And in the end, her feet led her on their own to Priya's small, cozy apartment in Queens, because in this entire city of 8 million people, Priya was the only person she could still trust, the only support left in a life that was collapsing around her. Priya opened the door, saw her friend's pale face and red-rimmed eyes, and without asking a single question, pulled Cora inside, wrapped a soft blanket around her shoulders, made her a cup of hot tea, then sat down beside her and waited quietly until Cora was ready to speak. And then everything broke loose. Cora couldn't keep it hidden any longer. She told Priya everything, or nearly everything, about that night at the party filled with dangerous people, about she had almost been kidnapped, about the man named Julian Voss who had come all the way to her apartment, and about the horrifying truth that her own father had betrayed her to the Dresco family, pushing her into the game of powerful people like a pawn meant to be sacrificed. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking, and Priya held her tightly, stroking her tangled hair, whispering gentle words of comfort, telling her that she wasn't alone, Cora, that she was here with her, that they would find a way, that she promised she wouldn't let anyone hurt her. In those warm arms, for the first time after so many terrifying days, Cora felt protected, felt like a human being instead of an object or a chess piece, and she clung to that friendship like a drowning person clinging to the last piece of wood. Priya suggested that Cora move in with her for a while, at least until things settled down, because her apartment was safer, more discreet, and no one would think to look for Cora there. And Cora nodded through her tears, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the seemingly boundless kindness of this friend. They sat together until late into the night, and Priya made more tea, listening as Cora poured out all the fear she had been carrying inside her, comforting her with the patience and tenderness of a true friend. Because the friendship Priya had for her, in every caring gesture, was real, not false at all, and that was exactly what would make everything later hurt so much. But in the middle of their conversation, when Cora reached the part about the Dresco family being behind the entire plot, Priya gently squeezed her hand and let slip that the Dresco family was known for its cruelty, that Victoria Dresco was a woman who never let any piece on her board go unused. And Cora stopped for a brief moment, because she had never mentioned the name Victoria, had never told Priya that the head of that family was a woman, and for one very short instant she looked up at her friend with a vague confusion passing through her mind. But then Priya smiled gently and explained in the most natural way that she had once read about that family in a few reports on the underworld, that anyone who had lived in this city long enough had heard vague rumors about names like that, and the explanation sounded so reasonable that Cora immediately pushed away the suspicion that had just begun to bloom, scolding herself for becoming so paranoid and distrustful that she was even doubting the friend who had opened her arms to her in her most desperate moment. She leaned her head against Priya's shoulder, letting the warmth and safety of the small apartment soothe her exhausted soul, and she drifted off believing that at least she still had one person beside her, one place to take shelter in the storm closing around her, never knowing that even this warmest refuge had been arranged in advance by the very hands tightening around her life, and that the friend holding her in her arms was carrying a heavy secret that could crush them both. The fragile peace inside Priya's apartment didn't last long, because only a few days later, when Cora had just left the hospital after a night shift and was standing at a traffic light on a deserted street corner, a car came tearing past so close that it knocked her hard onto the sidewalk, and in that single terrifying instant, a hand yanked her to her feet and pulled her behind a brick wall just before something worse could happen. When the panic settled and she realized she was still whole, Cora found herself surrounded and shielded by Tomas and two men dressed in black, and this time even she understood that it hadn't been an accident, that the enemy was no longer stopping at watching or threatening her, but had truly begun to strike, and that the world she had been dragged into was closing around her faster than she had imagined. Tomas gave her no time to think. He pushed her into a black car waiting at the curb, and though Cora struggled and protested, though she shouted that she didn't want anything to do with Julian Voss, that she only wanted to live her small life in peace, he answered with nothing but a cold sentence, that peaceful life no longer exists, that if she stepped out of this car, she wouldn't survive the night, and that his boss had ordered him to take her to the only safe place left. The car moved through the night, leaving behind the cramped streets of Brooklyn, crossing the long bridge and entering an area completely unfamiliar to Cora, where towering rows of trees stood motionless on both sides of the empty road, until at last it stopped before a massive black iron gate that opened automatically to let them in. Julian Voss's mansion emerged from the darkness like a silent fortress, enormous and cold, and when Cora crossed the threshold and stepped inside, she didn't feel overwhelmed by wealth the way she had expected. Instead, the first thing that struck her heart was an aching emptiness. Vast rooms with soaring ceilings lay drowned in shadow. Long hallways stretched endlessly with no sound of laughter or voices. No family photographs hung on the walls. No trace of warm life existed anywhere. Everything was perfect, luxurious, and cold as a museum people came to admire, rather than a place anyone was meant to live. And Cora suddenly realized that the most powerful man in the city lived alone inside a loneliness so immense that, even while frightened, she felt something in her chest tighten. Julian appeared at the end of the hallway, still in his familiar black suit, his face still cold and unreadable, and when Cora was led before him, she immediately erupted in resistance, saying she hadn't asked to be brought here, that she didn't want to owe him anything, that she would rather risk her life out there than be imprisoned inside this frozen fortress like a bird in a cage. Julian looked at her with those black eyes, and his voice rang out low and firm. "You think this is a choice, Miss Whitaker? You're wrong. Out there, they tried to kill you tonight, and next time, no one will reach you in time to pull you out of their path. I'm not keeping you here because I want to, believe me, Your presence is the last complication I need right now. But whether I like it or not, the whole world outside believes you belong to me, and if you die, that will be an insult I can't allow." Cora clenched both fists, angry tears rising to the corners of her eyes, but deep down she understood that he was right, that she no longer had anywhere to go, no longer had any choice left to make. And as she stood there inside that vast and empty mansion, beside the loneliest man she had ever met, Cora bitterly realized that the safest prison in the world had turned out to be the most dangerous place of all for her heart. The first days in the mansion passed heavily and silently. Cora was given a spacious but cold room upstairs, and she almost never crossed paths with Julian, the man who came and went from the mansion at strange hours of the night, vanishing for hours at a time into the underworld she was never allowed to know. She still carried hatred for him in her heart, hatred for the way he had dragged her into this hell, and she told herself she would keep her distance, that she wouldn't let herself soften toward the monster the entire city feared. But late one night, when she couldn't sleep and was standing by the window looking out over the black garden, she heard a sound downstairs, the sound of unsteady footsteps and a low, rough voice trying to suppress pain, and the instinct of a nurse urged her down before reason could stop her. She found Julian leaning against the edge of the long table in his study. One shoulder of his white shirt darkened, his face pale from the pain he was gritting his teeth through, while Tomas stood beside him with the awkwardness of a man far more familiar with holding a gun than bandaging a wound. In that moment, Cora forgot her hatred, forgot who he was, because before her there was only a wounded human being, and the deepest part of her, the part that had chosen the work of saving lives when she was still very young, spoke louder than everything else. She stepped forward, her voice unexpectedly firm even to herself. "Let me see," and she ordered Tomas to get the first aid kit, told Julian to sit down, and though he looked at her with suspicion, he still yielded and let her do her work. Cora's hands were quick and steady as she cleaned and treated the wound on his shoulder, hands accustomed to thousands of injured bodies over the years. But this time something was different, because when her fingers touched his cold skin, she felt not only one wound but countless old scars crossing one another, traces of an entire life sunk in violence and pain, and a sympathy she didn't want to admit stirred quietly inside her. Julian sat motionless beneath her hands, his dark eyes watching every movement she made with a strange attentiveness, as though no one had ever touched him with gentleness instead of hatred, and in the middle of that silence, he spoke softly, his voice low and rough. "Why are you doing this? After everything I've done to you, after I dragged you into this hell, you should have let me bleed." Cora paused for a moment, then lifted her eyes to meet his and said in a quiet but unwavering voice, "Because I'm a nurse, Mr. Voss, and to me, a human life is a human life, whether it belongs to an innocent child or the most powerful man in the city, whether it belongs to someone I love or someone I hate. I don't decide who deserves to be saved and who doesn't, because the moment people start weighing which life is worth more than another, that is the moment they lose their own humanity." Those words seemed to touch something very deep inside Julian, because she saw his stone-cold face crack for the briefest instant, a painful darkness passing through his eyes, an old pain she couldn't understand. And in that short moment he no longer looked like a monster, but like a lonely man carrying a wound inside him deeper than every scar on his body. When Cora finished bandaging him and stepped back, the two of them only looked at each other in the dim light, and though neither of them said another word, both of them felt that something invisible between them had just changed, that a small crack had appeared in a frozen wall, and that after tonight, it would no longer be easy for them to keep looking at each other as enemies. After the night, Cora bandaged his wound. A change difficult to name began to seep into the cold air of the mansion, and Julian started appearing more often, during the late hours when neither of them could sleep, sometimes only sitting silently in the same room, sometimes exchanging a few curt words, as though he were feeling his way toward facing an emotion he had buried for far too long. One night, when Cora entered the study to return a book she had borrowed, she found Julian standing motionless before the fireplace, holding an old picture frame in his hand, and the way he looked at that photograph, with a rare naked pain he had failed to hide in time on a face that was usually cold as stone, made her stop at the threshold. He didn't send her away. Instead, after a long silence, he spoke softly, his voice low and distant, as though echoing back from some far place in the past. Her name was May, my little sister, and she was the only person in this world who ever loved me unconditionally. Cora stepped closer quietly, and in the flickering firelight she saw the face of a young girl in the frame, a clear, bright smile and eyes shining with life, and Julian began to tell her, each word slow and heavy, as though every sentence tore open a wound that had never healed. He told her that when the two of them were young, their parents had died early, leaving only two children to lean on each other in the poorest and darkest neighborhoods of the city, that he had done everything, even things that made him lose pieces of his own soul, just so May could have food, a place to sleep, a future. But then May fell ill, an illness that needed urgent treatment, and he carried her to the hospital in the night with all the little money he had managed to gather. But back then, he was only a ragged, nameless poor boy, with no insurance, no deposit, no money, and the people there had looked at the two of them with indifferent eyes, had left them waiting hour after hour in a cold corner of the hallway, while May's condition grew worse and worse. Julian stopped, his hand gripping the frame so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And he went on in a broken voice Cora had never heard from a man who seemed as though he had no feelings left at all. They decided she wasn't worth saving, Cora, just because we had no money. They weighed my sister's life and concluded that it didn't have enough value. And she died right there on that stretcher, in my arms, in the middle of a place that was supposed to save people, simply because I was too poor to buy her life. Cora stood frozen, tears already running down her cheeks, because she understood, more than anyone else she understood that pain, understood the cruel injustice of a world where life was reduced to numbers, and she suddenly realized that what she had said the night before, about never weighing one life as worth more than another, had touched the deepest and most central wound inside him. She understood that all the cruelty, all the power Julian had seized through blood and darkness over so many years, had begun with that fateful night, with the vow of a shattered boy that he would never again let himself be powerless and poor, that he would become strong enough for the whole world to fear him, so no one could ever again look down on the lives of the people he loved. Cora stepped forward, and with an impulse she couldn't resist, she gently placed her hand over his as it clenched the picture frame, a soft and silent gesture, and she whispered that May didn't deserve to die that way, that no one deserved to die that way, and that she was so sorry for the boy he had once been, who had been forced to carry a pain far too heavy for his age. Julian lifted his eyes to her, and in those black eyes, for the first time, Cora no longer saw a monster, but an orphaned boy grieving the little sister he hadn't been able to save. And in that quiet moment beside the fire, an invisible thread bound two wounded souls together. Two people the world had cast aside, now finding in each other an understanding neither of them had ever dared to hope for. That night, after Julian had opened his heart about May, it seemed as though some door between them had cracked open, and they remained seated beside the dying fire in a silence that no longer felt heavy, but strangely warm, until Cora was the one who broke it, because she felt that if he had given her the deepest wound inside him, it would be unfair for her to keep her own wounds hidden. She began to speak softly, not in the dry way of listing misfortunes she had become so used to concealing, but in a small, trembling voice, as though for the first time she was truly allowing herself to feel it all again, saying that what she remembered most about her mother wasn't her face, because that face had faded little by little through the years, but her hands, the hands that were always warm when they rested on Cora's forehead whenever she was sick. And that feeling of being sheltered was the only thing that had ever made her believe the world had once been gentle with her. She told him that when her mother died, that warmth seemed to go with her, leaving behind a child who had to learn how to grow up by herself in a house that became colder and colder, beside a father she still loved even as he slowly lost himself. And she confessed that the most painful thing hadn't been poverty or the piling debts, but the feeling of watching someone she loved slide into the darkness while she stood helpless, unable to pull him back, the feeling of loving someone and resenting him at the same time, then blaming herself for the resentment. Julian listened without interrupting once, without a single impatient gesture, only watching her intently with those dark eyes that had softened so much now, and that attentive silence of his, that complete presence, made Cora feel heard in a way she had never experienced throughout her lonely life. She went on to tell him that this was why she had chosen to become a nurse. Not because she had dreamed of anything grand, but because she knew too well what it felt like to stand beside the bed of someone she loved and be unable to do anything. And she had promised herself that she would learn how never to be that helpless again. That she would become the warm hands resting on someone's forehead in their darkest moment, exactly as her mother had once done for her, so no one would have to leave this world in coldness and loneliness. When she reached that point, Julian spoke softly, his voice low and slow. "So both of us chose our paths from the same pain," he said. "The only difference is that you chose to save people, while I chose to become powerful enough that no one could ever hurt me again. And perhaps that is why I've lived all these years and still remained so alone, while you, no matter how much you've suffered, have kept something I lost a long time ago." Cora looked up at him, and in the last glow of the fire, she saw how alike the two of them were, despite standing at opposite ends of life. Both of them children the world had rejected, both of them carrying wounds that had never healed, different only in the ways they had chosen to survive. And it was that quiet understanding that made something tender and dangerous begin to take root between them. Neither of them dared to name it. Neither of them dared to reach out and touch it, because both of them knew this feeling beginning to bloom was forbidden, a recklessness that could destroy them both. But when the fire finally went out, and they were swallowed by darkness, in the small distance between them, Cora felt her heart beating in a way she knew it shouldn't, and she understood that her heart was silently betraying her reason, being drawn toward the loneliest man she had ever known, the one she should have feared more than anyone in the world. And yet now he had become the only person who made her feel understood all the way down to the deepest part of her soul. The fragile peace between them did not last long, because a few nights later, the mansion, usually so silent, suddenly filled with hurried footsteps and tense voices, and when Cora went downstairs to see what was happening, she came upon a sight that made her blood turn cold. In the middle of the great room, a young man was kneeling on the floor, his face pale with fear, held firmly by two of Julian's men, and standing towering before him was Julian Voss. Fully returned to the cold monster she had met on that first night, with no trace left of the man who had opened his heart beside the fireplace, his face hard as carved stone, his black eyes without even the faintest ripple of feeling. Tomas stood beside him, his voice low and urgent, as he explained that the young man, whose name was Eli, had been caught sending information outside, that he was the one who had leaked Cora's schedule to the Dresco family, leading to the attack on the street a few days earlier, and that in their world, betrayal carried only one price. Julian did not say much. He only gave a cold order to take the man away and deal with him the way traitors were always dealt with, and the way he said it, calm and decisive, as though ordering someone to clear away a piece of trash, made Cora shudder as she realized that the man before her had given orders like that hundreds of times without blinking. But then the young man named Eli broke down sobbing, begging in desperation, and through his broken words, Cora heard a truth that twisted her heart, that he had done it not out of greed or bought loyalty, but because the Dresco family had taken his sick elderly mother hostage, threatening to kill her if he didn't cooperate, and he had been forced into an impossible choice between loyalty to his boss and the life of the mother who had given birth to him. The detail of a son driven to desperation over his mother's life touched something too deep inside Cora, and before reason could stop her, she stepped straight into the middle of the room, placing herself between Julian and the kneeling young man, a reckless and insane act that left even Tomas stunned. She lifted her head and looked directly into Julian's black eyes, her voice trembling but not retreating. "Stop," she said. "Did you hear what he just said? He was only trying to save someone he loved, just as you once did, just as any of us would do. And if you hurt him now, how are you any different from the people who turned their backs on May all those years ago? The people who decided that some lives weren't worth saving." The whole room sank into a deathly silence, the air thickening, and every eye turned toward Julian, because no one, not a single person in all these years, had ever dared to stand in the way of an order from the Undertaker. In that moment, Cora saw a violent struggle rise in his eyes, the ruthless instinct forged through decades of darkness colliding with something new and fragile that she had only just planted inside his soul, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath as it waited. Then, very slowly, Julian loosened the hand he had clenched tight, turned his face away, and in a hoarse voice so low it was almost impossible to hear, ordered them to take Eli away and confine him instead of dealing with him, ordered an investigation into the abduction of his mother. And then he strode out of the room without looking back, leaving behind Tomas watching Cora with both astonishment and worry, and the men murmuring among themselves in shock. That night, standing alone in the room that had just witnessed something unprecedented, Cora understood that she had placed the first stone on the path toward softening that man. But she also dimly recognized a frightening truth, that his hesitation in front of his own men had revealed a crack in the iron empire he had built. And in a world where softness was seen as a fatal weakness, that crack could become the most dangerous thing of all for both of them. News that the Undertaker had stayed his hand before a traitor, news of the presence of a mysterious woman inside his mansion, spread through the underworld as quickly as fire across dry grass, and only a few days later, Julian received a message even he couldn't ignore, a summons from the Council of the Five Families, the highest authority made up of the heads of the 5 oldest crime bloodlines, the people who held the unwritten laws governing the entire underworld of the city. That night, Julian was forced to bring Cora with him, because she was the subject of this summons, and when the black car carried them to an ancient building hidden behind high walls, Cora felt a cold fear unlike anything she had ever known, because this time she was about to face not a single enemy, but an entire system of power that had existed for generations. They entered a vast room drowned in dim light, where 5 people sat on tall chairs arranged in a semicircle, their aged and cold faces marked by decades of ruling through blood, and in that suffocatingly solemn atmosphere, every gaze turned toward Cora with a cold scrutiny, as though she were an object being brought out to be appraised. The woman seated at the center, an old lady with silver hair and eyes sharp as ice, spoke first. She said this woman's appearance had created a weakness unlike any seen in Julian's many years of rule, that the entire underworld now knew. The Undertaker had something to lose, and a king with a weakness was a king dangerous to everyone's stability. According to their ancient laws, she declared, a situation like this had only 2 solutions. Either Julian had to remove this weakness, making the woman disappear from his life decisively and forever, or he had to formally declare her his wife before all the families, bringing her under the protection of the underworld's law and making her an inseparable part of the Voss Empire, and he had exactly 1 month to make his choice. Cora stood there, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet were splitting open, because both choices were sentences, one side death, the other being chained forever to the dark world she had always longed to escape. And then, from the shadowed corner of the room, a sweet yet icy voice rang out, and an elegant middle-aged woman with a cruel beauty stepped from the darkness, and Cora knew at once that this was Victoria Dresco, the one who had pulled the strings behind the entire tragedy of her life. Victoria smiled, a smile that sent a chill down the spine, then spoke with false concern, suggesting that it was such a pity for a powerful man like Julian to let himself be shaken by a poor nurse of uncertain background, and she left hanging a question thick with implication to sow doubt, asking whether any of the honored people present had ever wondered why this woman had happened to appear at exactly the right time, and in exactly the right place, whether she was truly as innocent as she seemed, or whether she was a pawn planted by someone else. And Cora went numb as she realized Victoria was skillfully bending her own plot into a spear aimed back at Cora, planting in Julian and the entire council the seed of suspicion that she might be the traitor. She quickly looked up at Julian, searching those dark eyes for trust, but his face was so cold and closed that she couldn't read it, and a painful confusion rose inside her, as she wondered whether Victoria's venomous words had managed to plant doubt in the man she had only just begun to trust. When they left that ancient building in heavy silence, Cora understood that the 1-month countdown had begun to tick, and that her fate now lay entirely in the hands of a man being torn between a newly awakened feeling and the poisonous suspicions his enemy had so cleverly planted. In the days after the summons, Julian became strangely distant. He began disappearing again at unusual hours, avoiding Cora's eyes, and the fragile warmth that had once started to kindle between them seemed to have been replaced by a heavy tension she couldn't understand, until late one night, he called her down to the study, and she stepped inside to find him standing by the window, with his back to her, his posture so lonely it made her heart ache. On the desk lay a leather briefcase, and when he turned around, his face carried a cold look of determination. But his eyes were hiding something she had never seen before, a pain held back to the very edge of breaking. He spoke in a low, even voice, trying to keep it from cracking, saying that he had arranged everything, that inside that briefcase was an entirely new identity, documents, a passport, money, a plane ticket to a small peaceful city on the West Coast, a house already prepared, a new life where no one from this world could ever find her, where she could begin again, continue working as a nurse, live the normal and safe life she had always longed for. Cora stood motionless, and what confused her was not the offer itself but the way he said it, because this time there was no envelope thrown onto the table with contempt, no tone that treated her like a complication to be cleaned up, but instead a painful tenderness hidden beneath every word. And she suddenly understood that the man standing before her did not want her to leave at all, but was forcing himself to let her go. She stepped closer and asked softly why. Why now? And Julian was silent for a long time before he spoke, his voice no longer able to hold on to its coldness. He said he had spent many nights weighing both choices the council had given him, and he had realized that if he declared her his wife, he would bind her forever to a world full of blood and darkness, turn her into the greatest target for every enemy he had, and then one day he would have to stand there and watch her be hurt because of him, just as he had once stood helplessly and watched May die, and that was something he couldn't endure a second time in his life. I lost the only person I loved because I was too weak to protect her, he said, his dark eyes now shining with a naked pain. And I won't let history repeat itself. I would rather let you hate me for the rest of your life, rather let you go far away and forget me, than have to watch you die because of the world I dragged you into. Because this time, for the first time in many years, I have something to lose again, and that frightens me more than any enemy ever could. That confession, spoken by a man who had never known how to express anything except coldness, struck straight into Cora's heart, and in that moment she realized a truth she had been running from for days, that she had fallen in love with him, had somehow fallen in love with this lonely and wounded man, had fallen in love with the person she should have feared most in the world. Tears rolled down her face, and she wanted to tell him that she didn't want to go, that she didn't want safety if the price was never seeing him again, but the words caught in her throat because she saw in his eyes a resolve that could no longer be shaken, a love expressed through this painful act of letting go. He stepped closer, gently wiped the tear from her cheek with a tenderness that shattered her heart, then whispered that someone would take her to the airport in the morning, that she should live well, live happily, and forget everything that belonged to this world, including him. Then he turned and walked quickly out of the room before she could see the tears threatening to rise in his own eyes, leaving Cora standing there alone in the cold study, holding a heart that had only just learned how to love, and already had to learn how to break. On the other side of the city, in a dark office buried deep within her family's territory, Victoria Dresco stood by the window, looking down at the lights of the night, with a rare irritation etched across her elegant face, because the intricate plan she had spent so much effort arranging was slowly slipping beyond her control. Her original scheme had been perfect, pushing that poor nurse into Julian's orbit, creating a connection that would make the entire underworld believe. The Undertaker had a weakness, and then using her like an invisible string to pull and manipulate him from a distance, forcing him to make concessions in territorial disputes, weakening him without the need to ignite a war that would damage both sides. But all of her calculations had collapsed, because instead of exposing that weakness for her to exploit, Julian had done something no one expected. He had taken the girl and hidden her inside his most heavily fortified mansion, surrounded her with his most loyal guards, made her completely unreachable. And the string Victoria had intended to use to control her puppet had now been cut cleanly away. The fury of failure drove that ruthless woman toward a decision far more reckless and direct. If she couldn't use the girl as a piece to manipulate him from afar, then she would turn her into bait to lure the beast himself out of his den, because Victoria understood perfectly well that once Julian had gone so far as to hide the girl that carefully, she must hold a special value to him, and bait valuable enough could make even the most cautious predator step into a trap. She summoned Felix, the henchman who had pushed Cora into that fateful party back then, and ordered him to find the girl's whereabouts at any cost. But Felix, though he had searched everywhere, couldn't get anywhere near Julian's heavily guarded mansion, and so he turned to the weakest link in the entire story, Cora's poor father. Felix and the Dresco men went to Walter Whitaker's shabby rented room, and this time they no longer used sweet words or promises to erase his debt, but naked threats instead, forcing that old and trembling man to reveal everything he knew about his daughter's whereabouts. Walter, already tormented by guilt because he himself had pushed his daughter into danger, tried to resist, begged them to spare his child, but before the cruelty of the Dresco men, that helpless father finally broke, and revealed that although he didn't know exactly where Cora was, he knew about Priya, knew about the only close friend his daughter trusted, knew about the connection that could be used to trace her. And then, instead of letting him go after draining every bit of information from him, Victoria Dresco gave a cold and calculated order. She ordered her men to keep Walter, to confine him in a locked room inside the family's lair, because that scheming woman understood that this father still had one final value. He could become leverage, a hostage for bargaining, a reserve card in case the main bait did not take hold, or in case she needed something more to control the girl. That night, when the trap had been laid and every piece had been moved into place, Victoria Dresco smiled again with her familiar cruel smile, because she knew it was only a matter of time before the thread she had just found would lead straight to the girl Julian was fighting so hard to protect. And when that happened, not only would Cora fall into her hands, but the most infamous monster in New York would walk by himself into the deadly trap waiting for him. While in that distant mansion, neither Cora nor Julian had any idea that the dark net was silently tightening around them. That fateful morning came faster than Cora could ever have imagined, because as she was preparing for the journey her broken heart did not want to make, with a car already waiting to take her to the airport according to Julian's arrangements, the vehicle was stopped along the way by strangers, and before the driver could react, Cora was dragged out of the car and taken away in a blur of chaos. When she woke from the dizziness, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, elegant but cold, with no windows, and the only door locked shut, and fear rose inside her as she realized that the thing she had always dreaded had finally happened. She had fallen into the hands of the enemy. Not long after, the door opened, and Victoria Dresco entered with the regal bearing of a queen, her haughty face touched by a cold smile, and she sat down in the chair across from Cora, studying the girl as though studying a small animal newly caught in a snare. Her voice was sweet yet sharp as a blade as she said that, at last she could meet face to face the woman who had made the untouchable undertaker lose his clarity of mind, and she admitted plainly that Cora was nothing more than bait, a piece of cheese set in a mousetrap to lure Julian into walking in by himself, that once he came to save her, the two of them would end together, and the Voss Empire would collapse to make way for the rule of the Dresco family. Cora, though trembling with fear, still tried to keep her voice from breaking, and she asked, "Why? Why do you desire power so much that she was willing to destroy so many lives?" And that question seemed to stir something inside that ruthless woman, because Victoria fell silent for a moment, and in that instant, her proud mask briefly cracked, revealing a deep exhaustion that neither money nor power could hide. But she quickly reclaimed her coldness, stood, and left, leaving Cora alone in the locked room. And it was during those hours of confinement, through the accidental whispers of the attendants coming and going, through tense phone calls echoing from the hallway, that Cora, with the sensitivity of someone who worked in medicine, slowly pieced together a secret Victoria Dresco hid more carefully than anything else. That powerful woman, who could buy nearly the entire underworld, was helpless before the one thing no amount of money could save. Her only daughter, the child she loved more than her own life, was in critical condition because of a devastating illness. A condition that even the finest and most expensive doctors Hermione had hired could only face by bowing their heads and admitting defeat. Cora listened, and little by little she understood that all of Victoria's cruelty, all of her mad ambition to seize power in recent days, might also have partly come from the desperation and pain of a mother forced to watch her child wither while being unable to do anything, a helplessness terrifyingly similar to the pain Julian had once carried with May. And she realized that even this vicious monster carried a very human wound inside her. And then, amid fear and despair, a faint thread of light began to kindle in Cora's mind, because she understood that although she had no gun, no power, no loyal men at her command, she had something neither Victoria Dresco nor all her money possessed: the hands and knowledge of a devoted nurse, a weapon she had never thought of before. And she began quietly calculating, not a hopeless escape plan, but a far bolder way out, a path in which she would use the very work of saving lives, the very belief that every life had value, to turn her most ruthless enemy into something that even she, in that moment, did not yet dare to name. While Cora was quietly calculating her way out, the door to the room where she was being held opened again. But the person who stepped in this time was not Victoria or one of her cold henchmen. It was a figure so familiar that Cora felt her heart stop. Priya, her closest friend, the person she had trusted absolutely, now standing there at the threshold with a tray of food in her hands and a pale face soaked with tears. In the first instant, a foolish hope flared up inside Cora. She thought Priya had followed the trail and come to rescue her, and she called her friend's name in choked relief. But when she saw the guilt and pain in Priya's eyes, when she saw that Priya didn't dare look straight at her and only lowered her head, trembling, a horrifying truth slowly opened inside Cora's mind, and the smile on her lips died away. Priya set the tray down with shaking hands, then collapsed to her knees in front of Cora and broke into sobs, and the broken confession that poured out through her tears tore Cora's heart into pieces, because it was Priya, her only friend, who had been secretly watching her and feeding information to the Dresco family from the very beginning to the very end. Cora went numb. She stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief, and asked why. Why was it you? In the shattered voice of someone who had just been betrayed by the last support left in her life. And Priya, through her sobs, told her the bitter truth behind everything. She told Cora that long before Cora ever knew the Dresco family existed, Priya's family back home had fallen under the control of that ruthless clan, that the people she loved were being threatened, and that she had been forced into a choice with no way out. Either get close to Cora and watch her under their orders, or watch her own blood relatives suffer terrible consequences. Priya said that at first, getting close to Cora had only been a cold assignment she had been given, that she had been planted in the hospital, arranged to become friends with the girl they were targeting. But then something neither she nor the Dresco family had expected had happened. The friendship between them had become real, that every moment Priya spent beside Cora, every time she comforted her, every embrace, every cup of hot tea, all of it came from a sincere affection she couldn't fake, and it was that very thing that had turned her mission into a torment that never stopped. Priya cried and said she had been trapped between two kinds of love, the love she had for her own family and the friendship she had for Cora, that every scrap of information she was forced to report felt like a knife she was driving into herself, that she had tried to delay, tried to hide parts of the truth, had spent so many nights awake in anguish, but she had been too weak and too frightened to dare resist, and she begged Cora to forgive her even, though she knew her guilt could not be forgiven. Cora sat there, tears sliding silently down her face, and inside her was a storm of emotions tearing against one another. Fury at being betrayed, pain at realizing that her warmest refuge had actually been arranged in advance. But at the same time, when she looked at the tear-drenched face of the friend kneeling before her, broken by guilt, she also saw something else, that Priya was not a cold-blooded villain, but another victim of the same ruthless force that had crushed Cora's life, a person pushed to the end of the road and forced to choose between things that could not be chosen. And even in that most painful moment, the deeply compassionate part of Cora, the part that had chosen the work of saving lives, and believed no one was entirely beyond saving, still spoke softly inside her, because she understood that both she and Priya were only small pawns being crushed beneath the hands of powerful people, and that if she let hatred take over her heart now, she would be no different from the very people who had caused all these tragedies. Just as Victoria had predicted, the bait she had set had lured in the greatest beast, because the moment Julian Voss learned that Cora had fallen into the hands of the Dresco family, he did not hesitate for even a second before charging into the trap he knew was waiting for him, bringing Tomas and his most loyal men with him. And that night, the usually quiet lair of the Dresco family was plunged into chaos as the rescue began. Footsteps thundered through the halls, shouts rang out, and disorder spread through the dark building. Inside the room where she was being held, Cora heard the commotion and knew that Julian had come, her heart rising with hope while tightening with fear for him, and taking advantage of the moment when the guards were drawn into the fighting and left their post. The door to her room flew open, but the person who appeared was not Julian. It was an old, thin figure she could never have expected, her father, Walter Whitaker. It turned out that all this time, he had been held inside this very building as a reserve hostage, and now, in the chaos of the rescue, the man who had failed so many times in life had managed to escape and grope his way toward his daughter, carrying in his heart one final resolve to make amends for all his mistakes. When father and daughter saw each other, Walter broke down crying. He threw his arms around Cora and stammered out choked apologies, saying he knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, that he was the one who had pushed her into all of this, that he had lived an entire life as a cowardly and selfish man. But now there was only one thing left he could do for her, and that was to get her out of this place, no matter what it cost. Father and daughter supported each other as they followed the dark corridors through the chaos, trying to find a way out, and for a moment Cora dared to hope they might escape. But just as they turned a hidden corner, they came face to face with one of Dresco's men, his weapon raised and aimed straight at her, and in that brief life and death instant, without a second of hesitation, Walter lunged forward, pushed his daughter behind him, and shielded her with his own body. A sound rang out, and then time seemed to stop as Cora caught her father's collapsing body, easing him down onto the cold floor. And she understood at once that the wound was too severe, that no medical miracle, no skilled nurse's hands could save him now, and her heart shattered under the pain of helplessness pushed to its furthest edge. Walter looked up at his daughter, with eyes that were slowly fading, yet shining with a strange peace, and he weakly lifted one trembling hand to touch her tear-soaked face, whispering with the last of his breath that he was sorry for being a terrible father, that he had loved her more than he had ever known how to show, that she was the only good thing his mistaken life had ever created, and that he hoped she would live happily, that she would love and be loved, that she would forgive him if she could. Cora held her father tightly, tears pouring down without end, and she told him that she forgave him, that she had always loved him despite everything, that he was her father and would always be her father, the words she knew he needed to hear in this final moment, and she saw a faint smile of relief touch his lips as he released his last breath, leaving this world in the arms of the daughter he had hurt all his life, and yet loved more than anything. Cora sat there in the dark and chaotic corridor, holding her father's cooling body, and in that numb moment, she wept for the father who had just died, wept for an entire life of mistakes redeemed by one final and most noble act, and wept for the bitter truth that sometimes the deepest love is only fully expressed in the very moment when someone must say goodbye. Hurried footsteps rang out, and Julian appeared at the end of the corridor amid the chaos, and when his dark eyes caught sight of Cora holding her father's motionless body in the pool of shadow, something inside him shattered. His stone-cold face twisted with a terrible rage, and he charged forward with all the ruthlessness of the monster the entire city feared, ready to drown the whole Dresco lair in a massacre for revenge. Victoria Dresco appeared as well, surrounded by the gunmen she had left, and in that moment, the corridor split into two sides facing each other, taut as a drawn wire, the two most merciless forces of the underworld preparing to collide in a bloody battle, whose only ending could be the destruction of them both, while the air thickened in the deathly stillness before the storm. But then, between the two lines of guns aimed at each other, a slender figure rose to her feet. It was Cora, her face still soaked with tears from having just lost her father, but her eyes shone with a steadiness no weapon could ever create, and she stepped straight between the two fields of fire, placing her unarmed body directly on that line between life and death. Everything seemed to freeze. Julian called her name in panic, ordering her to move away, but Cora did not step back. She stood there, looking from Julian to Victoria and then back to Julian, and she spoke, her voice trembling yet clear in the suffocating silence. "Stop it, all of you," she said. "Look at what you're about to do. Look at my father lying here. He died because of this insane cycle of hatred, and if you shoot at one another tonight, how many more people will have to fall? How many more children will have to hold their parents' bodies? How many more mothers will have to weep for their children?" She turned to Victoria, and with a courage that stunned the entire room, She spoke directly to the thing that woman had hidden most deeply. "I know about your daughter, Mrs. Dresco. I know she's in critical condition, and I know that all your power, all your money, all the wars you're throwing yourself into can't buy your child even one more day of life, because there are things in this world that can't be seized through violence or wealth." Victoria froze, her proud face going pale as though she had just been struck by a fatal blow, and Cora went on, her voice softer now but still carrying all its weight. "You've spent your whole life measuring which lives are worth more than others. You've treated my father, treated me, treated so many human beings as pieces that can be thrown away. But now you're the one tasting the helplessness of standing there while someone you love withers and being unable to do anything. The very feeling you've forced on so many others." "I'm a nurse," she said, "and I've seen enough death to understand that your world, your rules that know only power and blood, never account for the human heart, never account for choice, never account for love, and that is exactly why all of you are so alone, why you have everything and still have nothing." She looked at Victoria and offered something no one had expected. "Stop all of this and let me help your daughter, not as some miracle doctor, but as someone who will stay beside her and care for her, who will fight for every precious moment she has left with everything I know, because that is the one thing your money has never been able to buy, a person who truly cares." The silence stretched endlessly, and then the miracle happened. That iron woman, the one who had never shed a tear in front of anyone, slowly signaled for her men to lower their guns, her shoulders trembling, and for the first time, Victoria Dresco was no longer a ruthless matriarch, but only a desperate mother, clinging to the last thread of hope given to her by a girl, holding no weapon, and in that moment, words and compassion accomplished what no bullet ever could. When the gunfire had gone silent, and the hatred that had seemed impossible to resolve had just been soothed by an unarmed girl, Julian Voss stood there looking at the woman who had once been his sworn enemy, the one who had caused Walter's death, the one who had kidnapped the woman he loved, and by the ordinary laws of the world he had lived in all his life. This should have been the moment when he struck the final blow, when he took revenge and affirmed his absolute power. But he looked at Cora, looked into her red-rimmed eyes still shining with an undying faith in the human heart, and he understood that if he pulled the trigger now, he would lose forever the very woman who had taught him that a human life must never be weighed and measured, and that he would remain forever nothing more than the monster the world had made. And so, for the first time in his life sunk deep in darkness, the Undertaker chose to let go. He ordered his men to stand down, allowed Victoria to live, not out of pity, but because he understood that forgiveness was sometimes a greater strength than punishment. In the months that followed, Julian did something that shook the entire underworld. He gradually withdrew from the position of power he had fought for, in blood over so many years, handed most of his empire to the people he trusted, and quietly moved what remained into legitimate businesses in the light, because he realized that true freedom did not lie in ruling over others, but in being able to live a life where his heart no longer had to remain frozen. 3 years passed like a quiet river, slowly healing old wounds, and in a poor working-class neighborhood of the city, where people had once been rejected simply because they did not have enough money to be saved, there now stood a small clinic whose lights were always on, a place where anyone who walked through the door was cared for with complete devotion, and no one was ever asked how much money they had in their pocket. It was the free clinic Cora had built, turning the pain of her own loss into a legacy of compassion, in memory of a young girl named May who had died unjustly years ago, and in memory of a father who had redeemed everything with love in the final moment of his life, because Cora believed that the best way to honor the dead was to turn their tragedy into light for the living. Beside her, working devotedly every day, was Priya, the woman Cora had finally chosen to forgive, because she understood that her friend had also been another victim of the same ruthless force, and that forgiveness, not hatred, was what freed them both from the painful past. As for Victoria Dresco's daughter, although no miracle could hold the child in this world forever, her final months passed in warmth and care instead of coldness, and the once ruthless woman, after witnessing Cora's humanity with her own eyes, quietly left the old road behind and kept a fragile but lasting peace with Julian. One late afternoon, as golden sunlight stretched across the garden behind the clinic, Julian stood silently watching Cora laugh with a child whose wound she had just bandaged, and he softly asked her the question he had always kept in his heart. Do you ever regret it? Do you regret that fateful night? Regret choosing to stay beside a man like me, instead of the peaceful life you should have had? Cora turned to look at him, her eyes clear and filled with love, and instead of answering with words, she stepped closer, rose onto her toes, and placed a kiss on his lips. But this time it was no hurried kiss used as a disguise amid the chaos of darkness and gunfire. It was a gentle kiss, freely given, offered by a heart that had made its choice, and in that moment they both understood that the accidental kiss from years ago, once used to save his life, had in the end become the very thing that saved his soul, pulling him out of the darkness and giving back to him the human heart he had believed was long lost. The story of Cora and Julian leaves us with a profound lesson, that power, money, and hatred can never fill the emptiness inside a soul, that only love, compassion, and forgiveness can truly heal a person, that every life in this world is equally precious, and no one has the right to measure who deserves to live or who deserves to be loved, and that sometimes the kindness of an ordinary person holds more power to transform than every weapon in the world, kindling light even inside the darkest hearts. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue listening to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. And we would truly love to know how you feel about the story of Cora and Julian. Please leave a comment sharing the emotions from deep within your heart so we can listen and walk beside you. Thank you for spending your time listening until the very final moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.